Good morning. Welcome to our virtual National Cities Conference, Uncharted Urban Futures, Australian Cities Post-Pandemic. I am Dr. Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. I do thank all of you for your patience and your understanding with this last-minute move to a fully virtual conference. This is the result of a COVID-19 positive case at Ahuri's Melbourne office just last week. This in itself, I think, demonstrates that the emergence from the pandemic in our cities remains very much a work in progress. And it's an excellent example of the kind of adaptability that we will all be required to continue to show in the months ahead. It also means that today's conference about our Uncharted Urban Futures couldn't be better timed. So I welcome all of you as delegates of the conference, and we have people joining us from all around Australia and even some coming in from overseas. First of all, before we proceed any further, I would like to invite onto the virtual stage Uncle Ringo Terrick. Ringo is from the Wurundjeri people, and I invite him to deliver a welcome to country from Melbourne, where we're hosting this conference from today. Thanks, Uncle Ringo.
Thanks for that beautiful, kind welcome there, Tom. Just like to acknowledge, all my elders, past, present, emerging, ancestors in the dream time now, and all the kids that do such an amazing job down here at the Land Council in Melbourne, facilitating cultural heritage services right across the board. And also I'd like to acknowledge the facilitators today, particularly Katerina, that's been really instrumental in helping me navigate all this technology. Not easy for an old fellow like me, but we got there. My own experience, I was just speaking to you briefly there before, Tom, and I come from an urban centre, one of the main capital cities here in Australia, Melbourne, and I'd just like to also, welcome and acknowledge everyone from around the country, and you mentioned there's some people from abroad tuning in today, so greetings from Australia and from Melbourne, and welcome here to your online conference today that you all couldn't attend in person because of that one positive case that you mentioned earlier as well. But I come from the traditional people of Melbourne here and the First Nations people of Melbourne, and this has been our home since time began, basically, and for a lot of people that live here in Melbourne, this is now your home as well, and me personally, I value that connection. We have connection in that way, and I feel like there's change in the air this year. This current generation of Australians, while Melburnians, have this greater awareness and greater acknowledgement and respect for Aboriginal people these days, especially here in Melbourne, and I see it. It stands out very much when the Survival Day marches are on, and 80% of people that attend those marches are proud young Australians with a conscience and with deep respect of where they live, and I really acknowledge that, and I'm thankful for that. I've been waiting all my life for something, I've been waiting for the war in the Middle East to end. Excuse me, but I've also been waiting for that acknowledgement, and we're having talks about treaty and all that sort of stuff, and that's all evolving, but we're all evolving as well, and on a personal note, I've been, impacted by the colonisation and the genocide and all that sort of dark history from the past, and plays out in many ways for people. You know, there's our own trauma, and you know, I was homeless on the streets of Melbourne for 8 years. I'd have to get into one of the laundries in the high-rise flats around Victorian Collingwood and turn on the dryer and get near the blower with a rug around me through eight cold Melbourne winters, you know, and it troubles me to see all the people, you know, sleeping around in the streets with a blanket and a mattress, and I feel great sort of responsibility to those people as well, being a traditional elder here, and you know, you got to look after people on your country, and I'm also, you know, I had to go and do significant work on my issues and my trauma, and I'm just completing a 3-year residential rehab at Odyssey House, Victoria, and I'll graduate my program next month, and it's probably been the hardest thing I ever done in my life. But you know, I want to do now is go out and work with all those people that still live in that life and experience severe hardship and you know, haven't spoken to their trauma yet and haven't unpacked all that stuff, and I just want to commit myself to some service work in the future, and because it's out there and it's right in front of us and it needs addressing. And you know, I was taking a quick look on your website and I noticed, you know, that this sudden rise in homelessness issues for aged people, you know, and I think it was something like a 16% rise in the last 10 years. It's really concerning for people like myself, you know, that probably haven't put the hard work in that I have, and have found themselves at this point in their lives where they should have been relaxing with their grandchildren, but they're still pushing a trolley around the streets with all their bloody possessions in it. So, you know, I just want to say, you know, I'm grateful for organisations like yours, Tom, and you fellas, and yeah, let's start, you know, getting some more good positive outcomes for people, you know, in the immediate future, and start addressing the issues that need to be addressed. You know, that there's so much more around homelessness. You know, it's the mental health, and it's the addiction issues, and it's the legal and justice issues, and it's the long held trauma, and it's the stuff right back from your childhood and the institutional abuse and everything that else happens that people carry around in a little box in the back of their mind, and their hearts are broken and their spirits are broken. You know, so that's where it is. You know, and I'm committed to that in the future, and I know that you're committed to that too. So, you know, I feel very, you know, very lucky to be doing this work in the country for you fellas today, and very fortunate. And you know, coming from one of the oldest living cultures in the world and from the first family of the Melbourne area, I'd just like to, you know, extend a very warm and sincere welcome out to everyone tuning in today. So thanks very much for having me. Thanks for the respect, and may God deeply bless you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uncle Ringo, for that really gracious welcome to your country, and thank you too for, I guess, being vulnerable and sharing a bit about yourself in that process. It's important for all of us that we remember, of course, that our cities here in Australia are on lands that have been occupied for tens of thousands of years. So thank you once again, Uncle Ringo. Before I tell you a bit more about how today's conference will work, I would like now to thank our two official conference partners, Infrastructure Australia and the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, or DELP. The support of both organisations has made it possible for us to deliver this conference, and that has been especially important after the challenges that we've all faced over the last 18 months. So thank you. I'd also like to recognise and to thank our 3 conference supporters, the Planning Institute of Australia, the Council of Capital City Lord Mayors, and the Australian Property Institute. Thank you. Today, we are here to talk about how our cities are going to function as we begin to emerge from the global pandemic. Despite the challenges of the last week, for those of us at Uhuru, we are all aware that our country is well and truly moving on a path to recovery from the pandemic now. Our cities, however, and particularly our largest cities, Melbourne and Sydney, still have very many challenges ahead of them as we open up and return to some semblance of normal. The program today will examine 3 core topics: Australia's changing population dynamics as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, the delivery of critical social infrastructure to support our changing cities, and the particular urban transport challenges emerging from the pandemic. We will also feature 2 research presentations from the inaugural Uhuru Cities Research Agenda, one on urban transportation innovation and the other on access to social infrastructure. Now, I just need to give you a little housekeeping to ensure that you're best placed to participate in today's event. All right, so we're using this particular conference platform. You have the option of submitting questions during the sessions today, as well as participating in a live discussion forum with your fellow delegates. So to the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a tab that says live Q&A, and you can select this tab and use it to send questions to the session facilitator. You also have the option of selecting the discussion forum tab, and that's a tab that you can use to chat with fellow delegates and to comment on presentations and discussions. The other thing that you can use is the session notes tab, and you can use this as a method of capturing any interesting comments that you've seen, and you can then email them to yourself to read later as well and to have on file. If you have any technical issues during the conference at all today, please don't post these on the Q&A or the discussion forum. Instead, there's a red live support icon, which is in the top right-hand corner of the screen. And if you push on that, our team behind the scenes will do their best to assist you with whatever technical difficulties you may be having. So don't worry also if you miss anything due to any technical difficulties. We will be making recordings of the sessions, and these will be available for you to come back to in the next few days. At the end of each session, you will return to the timeline, and that's in the top left-hand corner of your screen. You just need to click on the next session via this timeline when it's time for that session to start, and that will let you back in. Well, we have a very packed program today, so we're going to get straight into it now. Our first speaker is the Federal Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts. It's the Honourable Paul Fletcher. Minister Fletcher wasn't able to be here live today, but he has recently recorded this video address, which we will now play for you. Minister Fletcher.
I'm very pleased to be joining this conference of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. And of course, I welcome the fact that Uhuru is becoming increasingly involved in public policy issues concerning the future of our cities and the infrastructure that will support them. And certainly this conference on Uncharted Urban Futures, Australian cities post-pandemic, is a good example of Uhuru's involvement in this policy space. What I want to speak about this morning is, first of all, the importance of cities. Secondly, the impact of the pandemic on our cities. And then I want to look at cities policy as we respond to the pandemic and as we proceed past the pandemic, and the various policy levers that the Commonwealth Government is deploying in this area. But let's start with the importance of cities. The design and functioning of our cities is important to the well-being, to the quality of life, to the prosperity of Australians. Australia is one of the most urbanised countries in the world. 64% of us live in our 5 biggest cities, 84% of us live in our 21 biggest cities, and almost 90% of us live in cities or towns, which is one of the highest rates of any country in the world. What we have also been seeing, certainly prior to the pandemic, was that cities were growing at a faster rate than the overall population of the country. In the business jargon, our 4 biggest cities were taking market share. They grew at an annual rate of 2.1% from 2006 to 2016, compared to a 1.7% growth rate for our total population. Our cities are not just where most of us live, they're also critical to our prosperity. They're where most of our economic activity occurs. 80% of economic activity is generated in our 8 capital cities, and they account for 2/3 of employment. Despite that, until recently, the federal government has not tended to have a major policy focus in relation to cities. Or to put another way, we haven't really used a city lens in defining and executing on federal government policy objectives. Since our Liberal National Government came to power in 2013, however, we have sought to become more involved in cities policy, reflecting many of the factors that I spoke about, including the high and increasing proportion of Australians who live in our largest cities. We've now had for some years a cities portfolio at the Commonwealth level, and I'm pleased that in December last year the Prime Minister appointed me to this portfolio for the second time. A key policy tool we're using to give effect to our cities policy is the City Deal. The concept of City Deal started in the UK in 2011, and we drew heavily on the UK approach, although we've adapted the system to Australian conditions. Particularly, of course, the UK has to struggle by with only 2 levels of government, whereas we are blessed with 3. And that does mean that it certainly influences the shape and design and structure of our city deals. We announced our first city deal for Townsville in 2016, and since that time we've agreed 8: Perth, Darwin, Adelaide, Geelong, Hobart, Launceston, Townsville and Western Sydney. And I'll have a bit more to say about those in a moment. But let me turn next to the impact of the pandemic on our cities. Because since the pandemic hit Australia, we've carried out a giant unplanned experiment in working and studying from home. This has had a significant impact on the CBDs of our big cities, with the number of people physically coming into the CBDs dropping very sharply in 2020. The Property Council, which represents the owners of many of our big city office blocks, reports that occupancy levels in those buildings are still well down from pre-pandemic levels. As at June 2021, occupancy levels in Sydney stood at 67% of average pre-pandemic levels, and in Melbourne it was back down to 26% after having got up to 45% in May. Now, of course, the Sydney number I've just cited was before the most recent lockdown and presumably would be lower now. Unsurprisingly, these developments have led some to argue that cities in the future will operate very differently from what we've become used to over the last few decades, and that we'll see the demise of CBDs as we know them today. On this particular view, argued for by some, people much prefer to work from home and only come into the office occasionally. We've now proved to ourselves that working in this way is perfectly feasible, and as a result, we're going to see a permanent change in the way people behave, and particularly a reduction in the number of people who come into the CBD to work. Now, as I say, that's the view put by some, and it is true that there are some things we have collectively learned over the last year or so. We've learned that we can do much more on screens than we'd previously realised. A combination of the widespread availability of broadband, widespread availability of devices with cameras and microphones, whether smartphones, tablets or laptop or desktop computers, and software tools to make it all relatively easy to use, whether Zoom or BlueJeans or WebEx or Teams, or the many other packages we've all become very familiar with. All of this has underpinned a capacity to work considerably more effectively from home than many of us had previously realised was possible. The National Broadband Network was key to this, and it certainly rose successfully to meeting the challenges of the pandemic and the spike in demand. Traffic levels were up 40% during the day compared to pre-pandemic levels. When the pandemic hit, the rollout of the NBN had reached a point where 98% of premises were able to connect, and today we have over 8.1 million premises connected around Australia. This is certainly a far cry from the failing project we inherited in 2013 when we came to government, when barely over 50,000 premises were connected to the fixed line network. So certainly one of the factors that helped get us through the pandemic was the widespread availability of the NBN. All that being said, as we think about the implications for our cities in the future, what we don't yet know is how we will behave once the pandemic is behind us and there's no longer a health-driven need for many people to work from home. Now, it is possible, as some have argued, that we'll see permanent and profound changes in the way that people work. Fewer people working from CBD offices, more people working in the suburbs or in regional areas. And if that turns out to be true, it could well have significant implications for the way we design cities and the transport arteries that allow people to move around them and between them. It could, for example, mean that existing owners of CBD buildings or tenants in those buildings, businesses based in those buildings, need somewhat less space for a given number of employees, with a typical employee spending less time in the office and more time working from home. It certainly does not follow from that, though, that necessarily means a decline in the future of CBDs, because we may see some existing tenants reducing their space needs, but we may see opportunities for other kinds of tenants, start-up businesses, creative businesses, social enterprises and others. But the first thing we need to do is see how people behave once the pandemic is behind us. Because the truth is, we don't yet know what the long-term legacy of COVID will be for our cities. There is, though, emerging research that suggests that claims about the demise of the CBD may be somewhat overstated. For example, PwC, the consultants, put out some work in February this year showing that 66% of Australians would prefer to connect with other people as part of being in a physical workplace. It's interesting that in those Property Council statistics I cited earlier, we did see in the first quarter of 2021 significant increases in CBD occupancy in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. That's to say we'd had a dip through COVID and then starting to see those numbers rise. And I was interested to see comments recently by the Harvard economist and a leading voice on cities policy, Edward Glaser, who had this to say, quotes, "We are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. This year of plague and social isolation should, if anything, remind us of the joys of the city." So certainly, I think we can expect to see some more innovative and flexible working arrangements in the future. I think that will be a legacy of the pandemic and how we've all responded. But to leap to the conclusion that the office is dead and that CBDs, as we know it, will be fundamentally reshaped, I think it's far too early to draw that conclusion. I make the point, of course, that while we may have seen some reduction in activity in our CBDs, we've also seen a growth in activity levels in other parts of the city, particularly in suburbs, where we've seen more people in coffee shops, for example. And that links to one of the emerging trends in the development of our bigger cities, particularly Sydney and Melbourne, as they reach levels of 5 million and beyond. Moving away from having a CBD, a single CBD, which is a major focus for many people in coming into work, and moving more to multipolar cities. And that's certainly underpinned the work of the Greater Sydney Commission in coming up with the 3 cities strategy for the Sydney metropolitan area, the Harbour City, the River City and the Western Parkland City. Well, let me turn then to policy levers that the Commonwealth is using when it comes to cities policy and how we intend to continue to use those as we come through the pandemic and go beyond it. The first such policy lever is major transport links, and that's always been a factor in shaping cities, and the Commonwealth is a very major investor in significant transport projects around the country. For example, we've got a $5 billion commitment to the Melbourne Airport rail link in partnership with the Victorian government. That will provide direct train travel between Melbourne Airport and the CBD in under 30 minutes without changing trains. Construction expected to begin next year and the line expected to be operational by 2029. There's our $5.3 billion commitment to Western Sydney Airport, and indeed major transformation of Perth with the MetroNet set of projects, $6.1 billion of projects, ultimately delivering some 70 kilometres of new rail lines, and total Commonwealth commitments to date to that project, some $2.7 billion. So one of our key policy levers then is integrating urban planning with transport planning, and this is where the use of city deals is particularly been a focus for our government. Through the Western Sydney City Deal, we're working with the New South Wales Government and 8 Western Sydney councils with multiple elements in this city deal. A new city precinct near the airport, the Aerotropolis, now to be named Bradfield, careful focus on urban planning. Under the Hobart City Deal, the State Parliament has passed a new Greater Hobart Act to support a collaborative approach to infrastructure and strategic land use planning. So we're using city deals to bring together transport infrastructure and other factors designed to have a more integrated approach. Our city deals typically also can involve centrepiece projects. One example is the Launceston City Deal with the University of Tasmania campus moving to Inverest, just across the river from the Launceston CBD, or in Adelaide, where under the Adelaide City Deal there's significant investment going into Lot 14, the Centre for Innovation and Entrepreneurship on the vibrant North Terrace. And there are other features of city deals that across different city deals reflecting the needs of particular cities. For example, again looking at planning issues and how to support development in rapidly growing urban areas. Those are some of the issues we're considering in the South East Queensland City Deal, which is presently the subject of negotiation between the Commonwealth, the Brisbane City Council and other South East Queensland Council, South East Queensland Council of Mayors and Queensland Government. And we continue to look at other levers that we can use in city deals. One that's of interest to me as Commonwealth Arts Minister is arts projects. The capacity of things like major sculpture projects to energise city areas, and indeed an Australian business called Urban Art Projects, based in Brisbane, has done some terrific work around the world in this area. So I conclude by observing that our cities have a strong and vibrant future. It's true that the lockdowns that we're seeing do present some short-term challenges. They're having an impact over particularly a 1 to 2 year time frame. But I do believe that over a longer term time frame we'll continue to see the underlying long-term trends play out, with cities continuing their economic importance and their role in a knowledge economy. That's why the Commonwealth is partnering with state and local governments to support the growth and functioning of our cities. And as I've sought to explain in touching on the elements of a number of city deals, we are making significant progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Fletcher. Well, it's our pleasure now to be able to follow the Minister's address with one from his federal counterpart, Andrew Giles, MP. Andrew Giles is the Shadow Minister for Cities and Urban Infrastructure, as well as the Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs and the Shadow Minister Assisting for Immigration and Citizenship. Mr. Giles is able to join us live today, so he will provide an address now, and then he will join me, time permitting, for a few quick questions. So please do feel free to submit some questions via the live Q&A function today. Please now welcome Mr. Andrew Giles.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'm joining you all from Wurundjeri land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge what a generous and gracious welcome we received from Uncle Ringo earlier. Tom, can I also say thank you to all at Uhuru for bringing this conference together in the first instance, and particularly in navigating the challenges in a very short space of time in moving to a virtual format. My thoughts are with Michael and all the team. While I'm disappointed that we can't be doing this face to face, It is wonderful to be able to carry on this conversation, and I'm pleased that I'm sharing this session with Minister Fletcher, and I look forward to hearing from Romilly as well. Last week, The Economist observed that while in February 2020, around 5% of the hours worked by Americans were worked from home, 3 months later, that proportion had grown to 6 in 10. A similar thing happened in Australia too, indeed across advanced economies. Understanding the implications of this shift and the extent to which it will continue presents a profound challenge to policymakers today. As we begin to contemplate our re-engagement with the world, we can't neglect national urban policy. Our cities and their suburbs are the places where the vast majority of Australians live and work, and where a similar proportion of our GDP is generated. Before COVID, they were engines of growth in both these respects, attracting internal migration and immigration from overseas, attracting investment, growing jobs, building wealth. To drive a real recovery, we simply must recharge our cities. This means better appreciating the impacts of the pandemic and the extent to which changes are likely to be enduring. In these remarks, I want to focus in particular on changes in how work has been done over the past 18 months, how this might continue, and what this means for the shape of our cities. There has never been a more exciting time to be involved in urban policy, to have the chance to think about what the pandemic has taught us about how our cities work and how they might work better, and then to put in place the policy levers to realise this vision collaboratively. Effective and enduring urban policy rests on cooperation and shared understandings between different levels of government and with the private sector and the community. How we develop arrangements to foster these relationships is a key responsibility for national government. Here, we must do better and be clearer about what we are doing, why and how. Now, I recognise that we've seen some progress in the state of our consideration of national urban policy. The political debate now is about what should be done rather than whether anything should be done. When Malcolm Turnbull replaced Tony Abbott as Prime Minister, he returned cities to the national stage, where it needs to be. But not all the damage done under Mr Abbott was remedied in this respect. The institutional framework he dismantled wasn't repaired. The mechanisms driving evidence-based policies and close collaboration remained underdone. And more recently, we've witnessed what I would describe as a slow retreat from the field under Mr Morrison. City deals are withering on the vine. Other collaborative mechanisms wound down. The National Cities Performance Framework, designed to provide an evidence base to guide investment in our cities, has been quietly dumped. The National Cabinet excludes local government, and its agenda discloses little interest in urban policy. And with our cities having borne the brunt of the impacts of the pandemic, this is a worry and a major handbrake on our recovery. In this urban century, as the rest of the world sharpens its focus on cities, Australia's government seems to be looking the wrong way. Earlier this week, President Biden signed his $1 trillion infrastructure package into law, with massive investment in urban transit, including EV infrastructure, and $5 billion US for active transit infrastructure. COP26 included a strong statement on transit, recognising the need for accessible and affordable zero-emissions vehicles, and also the role active public and shared transport has to play in achieving a sustainable future. New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and the ACT are all signatories to the relevant declaration, but our federal government is missing in action. What's missing here really is an overarching policy framework to secure cities that are more sustainable, more livable and more productive. The institutions to drive this, and frankly, a national interest in and national responsibility for what's been happening to those places in which the vast majority of Australians live and work. Now, in focusing on how the pandemic has changed how we work, I don't want to suggest that this has been all-encompassing. Not everyone can work from home, of course. And there's an important debate to be had around some of the inequities that have affected essential workers in this time. But the shift that has occurred in where and often how knowledge work has been undertaken has a particular significance with wide-ranging implications. Understanding this, in my view, is a critical foundation for urban policy in all its dimensions, driving economic and productivity growth, fostering greater sustainability and securing more livable cities for all citizens. So the Productivities Commission's recent research paper on working from home provides some instructive pointers on the impact of hybrid work on the location of economic activity and on the shape of Australian cities. Earlier this year, this was a focus of Anthony Albanese's speech to the AFR Summit, in which he outlined Labor's approach to urban policy and anticipated much of this in his articulation of an urban policy fit for present and also future purposes. The Productivity Commission found that up to 40% of Australian workers have been working from home during the pandemic, and that the level of work from home is very likely to remain much higher than pre-pandemic. It's important to recognise the views of both workers and employers as being broadly positive about working from home, some of the time at least. The evidence regarding productivity is less straightforward. There are positive indicators, but also some concerns about the negative impacts for innovation when we lose proximity. These developments haven't eliminated the need, nor indeed the desire for personal interaction either. What's clear is that working from home has had a huge impact on how and how much we move around and on our patterns of consumption. This latter point is too often passed over, I'd venture. None of this is to suggest that the debate over the future of work is anywhere near settled. Clearly it isn't and won't be for some time, indeed, if ever. But the point is to recognise the key challenges and opportunities that demand policy responses. And there are a number of workplace-related considerations that will drive the future of working from home, including practical issues related to the structured management of hybrid models, wage premiums for issues for work performed in traditional offices, perceptions of professional and career development, implications for unpaid domestic work, and indeed for well-being more broadly. For policymakers, the prospect of the geographic link between where people live and where they work changing carries far-reaching implications in terms of how cities function as economies, as labour markets, and of course as the places where we make our lives. Now, the pandemic has enabled us to shift our thinking about what the boundaries of a city can and should look like. Instead of relying on the physical barrier of an urban growth boundary, the leaps and bounds we've taken in digital infrastructure over the past 2 years allows us to consider the boundary in terms of connection to place, whether physical or virtual. The blended city, comprised of both the physical city we've understood for hundreds of years and the digital city of virtual participation and labour market access without being physically present, comes with its own unique opportunities and challenges. How to build a sense of community in a place where people are geographically dispersed and may only visit each other once a week, if ever. And what does this mean for workers in our cities who can't work remotely? How does this model help them? There's already evidence to suggest, for example, that people tend to be willing to tackle longer commutes if this isn't something they do every day. In the first quarter of this year, I note, just over 5,000 people moved from Melbourne to regional Victoria and just over 5,000 from Sydney to regional New South Wales. Complexities abound in predicting the future, of course, including the uncertain impacts of immigration. The size and nature of our migration program over the coming years will shape our cities and our infrastructure needs. The unpredictable nature of the health crisis and the associated changes to how we live and work makes clear the need for a robust framework and a collaborative approach to meeting our infrastructure and planning challenges moving forward. Last week, The Age reported on research conducted by the Property Council that suggested Melbourne CBD occupancy was at 4% in October. In the decade leading up to the pandemic, research from the Grattan Institute showed that half of Australia's jobs growth had been concentrated in the centres of Melbourne and Sydney. So the stakes are really high when we think about what this means for our economic recovery. This is why Labor's been calling for a plan for our CBDs. Merely pleading for workers to return to their desks won't cut it. And let me be clear, I don't think the pandemic has changed the economics of agglomeration. The reasons major knowledge businesses clustered in the centre of our cities are the same heading into 2022 as they were before we'd heard of COVID-19. The rise of digital technologies, indeed their ubiquity, didn't change this, far from it. These are significant developments which will leave their mark on our city centres, but that's not to say these will decline. The Productivity Commission's dive into hybrid work found that reports of the death of the CBD have been greatly exaggerated, with the benefits of physical proximity remaining their strongest in high density areas. Simply because work can be done remotely does not mean it all should be done remotely. Few workers and fewer bosses have expressed such a preference. So many tasks, and I would venture all relationships, benefit from personal interaction. Let's conceive of the central cities central areas of major cities as spaces for such interaction and activities, not simply as business districts now. Whereas traditional office occupancy presents some obvious challenges, particularly to the businesses that depend on the custom of office workers, cafes, dry cleaners. But there are opportunities too. Lower rents offer the prospect of attracting new entrants. Buildings might be repurposed, entertainment venues can emerge, and the idea of the centre as a place, the place perhaps, where citizens can gather together for reasons unrelated to work becomes a prospect. And as workers return to their offices, we need to consider not just how many people are returning to the physical workplace, but who is returning. Research by Hassel has found generation and seniority divides in the desire to return to the office, with those in management positions and older workers more likely to want to return to the physical workplace. There's a gender divide too. 47% of men would prefer to work primarily in the office compared to 36% of women. If workers are given the choice to return to the office according to their preference, these demographic differences will impact on how the places around our workspaces form. The services, transport and retail needs of a young female junior employee and an older man in management may well be vastly different. Instead of thinking about how to support a CPD recovery, the question for policymakers really should be, how can we reimagine our city centres? As we gather today, city centres around Australia are being transformed through pop-up bike lanes, reclaimed public space and countless other initiatives. This deserves to be matched through the engagement of a national government that's not afraid of the future and which is keen to partner with people closer to the ground to help realise city centres that are both engines of economic and productivity growth and exciting, safe and democratic shared spaces accessible to all. So I'm excited about the future of our city centres. And equally, if we get the policy framework right, I can see an evolution towards more distributed Australian cities with more opportunity and access to amenities for more of their residents. Because the experience from working from home, and for many Australians, geographically bounded lockdowns, highlights the critical importance of place and placemaking. This experience has not been equal across our cities. Research commissioned by the NGAA found outer suburbs residents had better experiences of both their work and home life while working remotely, compared to those living closer to the centre. Working from home had positive impacts on their productivity, health and relationships, with 10% more outer suburban workers feeling that working remotely had a net positive impact on their life than those in inner suburbs. Yesterday's broadband announcement by my colleague Michelle Rowland should resonate with these workers. But prior to the pandemic, the experience and opportunities available across our cities weren't even either. In each capital city, we saw the same pattern emerge. A number of highly livable but unaffordable suburbs concentrated close to the centre, and on the outskirts, low levels of livability with more restricted public transport options, less access to social infrastructure, and limited public green space. The right national urban policy framework is the key to addressing inequalities in our cities. Get it wrong, we end up with worsening urban congestion, declining housing affordability, a bigger carbon footprint, and a deteriorating sense of social cohesion. It's time to think about our social compact as having a physical or geographic dimension, to think about the goods, services and amenities everyone should be able to readily access from their home. And to me, this is the essence of a 20-minute neighbourhood. But reports in The Guardian this week revealed the chasm between what homeowners are promised when building in a new estate and what is delivered. Train stations, schools, shopping centres, the things that make places livable, never built. And this is an ongoing issue. The number of new housing unit lots sold in some areas tripled last year without matched investment in transport or social infrastructure. Instead of working to support growth suburbs establish themselves and thrive, the Morrison government has been leaving them behind. Nowhere is that clearer than in the administration of the Commuter Car Park Fund, where decisions have been made solely on the politics, not the evidence, not on need. The challenge before us now is to take action to secure more resilient Australian cities so that their productivity, sustainability and livability is assured. This has to be core business of a national government concerned to deliver a more prosperous future and to deliver on its side of the social contract. Like the Minister, I've been reading Mr Glazer, and as he writes along with Mr Cutler in The Survival of the City, they say the vulnerability of large, dense, interconnected cities requires an effective, proactive public sector, a shared strength that serves everyone. Now, it's long been recognised that fragmented governance holds cities back, and this is a particular problem for Australian cities. This concern has recently been expressed by Uhuru in its report on innovation in urban transportation, a critical foundation for reshaping our cities. Noting the efforts of some state governments to expand and reconfigure public transport networks and support active transit, this report found that the ability to properly implement this new urban agenda continues to be impeded by governance and regulatory barriers. Now, we simply can't afford to ignore this as an obligation on the part of national government. And Labor is up for this challenge. Indeed, we're excited by the future. After more than 8 years of denial, neglect, and too many missed opportunities, it's time for a new deal for urban Australia. There is a framework now in place, but it needs to be built on. Firstly, by commissioning an independent review to consider the role and purpose of Infrastructure Australia in the modern infrastructure landscape, as my colleague Catherine King announced recently. The 2021 Infrastructure Plan sets an ambitious vision for the country, recognising the importance of forming a sense of place through our investments and prioritising the social and environmental infrastructure we need to make our cities livable and sustainable. Unfortunately, IR has been undermined by the Morrison government, more interested in the political benefits of infrastructure spending than making long-term city-shaping investments. Recognising the impact of 8 years' neglect on urban infrastructure strategy has had in our cities, we will establish a cities and suburbs unit within Infrastructure Australia. This unit will make recommendations to government on the design of a new urban policy framework informed by expert evidence and community input. The unit will release an annual State of the Cities report to measure the progress and performance of our cities and identify the specific initiatives of local councils, state planning authorities, which are effectively working to create more productive and sustainable communities. As we look to build back better from COVID, effective transport policy and targeted infrastructure investments can help build equity into the heart of communities across Australia. And having strong independent evidence and advice is fundamental to getting these investments right. We also need to bring people with lived experience and expertise back to the centre of our decision making to put in place the strategic and considered national urban policy we need. To that end, Labor has committed to bring together a renewed urban policy forum to complement the cities and suburbs unit. The forum will bring together experts from across all levels of government, as well as industry and academia, to make sure we get the long-term policy settings right. This is also why we will bring local government back into national cabinet. Local councils have been leading the way on creating sustainable and livable communities, but these efforts have been constrained by a lack of engagement, a lack of recognition, and a lack of interest from government. And a lack of national leadership in the city deals has left the ambitions of the program unrealised. Uhuru's research into the City Deals program is clear. The program has the potential to create economic opportunities and productive urban environments, but the current absence of transparent governance arrangements and lack of collaboration is holding us back. We need a national government committed to achieving shared objectives and delivering transformative city-shaping projects, not just the ones on the present federal government's wish list. Creating vibrant cities post-COVID will require collaborative long-term partnerships with local and state governments, as well as businesses and communities. This means genuine city partnerships built from the ground up, as city deals always should have been. The start of the pandemic carried with it innumerable predictions of the end of the city, linking density to the inevitable spread of disease. This was ahistorical and has proved far from prescient. But that's not the same as saying we could ignore the impact of COVID on urban life and work, nor fail to respond to the changes it has been making and the things it has revealed. We have an opportunity to do better and to be better. We can't continue to have a federal government drifting aimlessly through this vital period of rebuilding. We need a federal government that's committed to an effective national urban policy framework and committed to listening to and collaborating with all the groups with an interest in this framework. That's an Albanese Labor government. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Giles, for your remarks just now. Unfortunately, we have run a little short on time, so I don't think we're going to have time for an actual Q&A, but I do just want to really thank you so much for joining us today, for making the time to be here live with us. We've really appreciated that and what you've had to say. So on behalf of our virtual audience, Mr. Giles, I'd like to thank you once again, and we look forward to speaking further and hopefully meeting in person in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you.
The final part of our session this morning is our keynote address. Romelu Mcgee AO is CEO of Infrastructure Australia. Romilly is responsible for overseeing Infrastructure Australia's critical role in helping governments prioritise the projects and reforms that best serve our Australian communities. It's been a very busy year for Infrastructure Australia, and they are playing an important role advising the federal government on infrastructure priorities, and particularly as we respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and its various impacts. Please join me in welcoming Romelu Mcgee.
Thank you very much, Tom. I really appreciate the kind introduction. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land here in Canberra. We're down here for a few days, so I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the custodians of the land and the waterways, and where we're all meeting today. And as I said, I'm here in Canberra, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge my fellow speakers, the Honourable Paul Fletcher, Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts, and Andrew Giles, who just spoke, Shadow Minister for Urban Infrastructure. And I also want to extend my thanks to Michael and the entire Uhuru team. We've really appreciated and valued Uhuri's contribution as a partner in the development of our advice on Australia's urban and social infrastructure needs, an area which is increasingly critical as we move to a new COVID normal. Today, I'm proud to provide an overview of the 2021 Australian Infrastructure Plan, an incredibly comprehensive and wide-reaching reform document, unlike anything that has ever been published in Australia before. The 2021 plan is intended to support the Australian Government's objectives for infrastructure to deliver social and economic benefits, shape productive and livable cities, and provide connectivity to regional and remote areas. The reforms in this landmark document are designed to be practical and actionable, and are focused on supporting the national COVID-19 recovery and delivering the infrastructure our communities need. Spanning the transport, energy, water, telecommunications and digital, waste and social infrastructure sectors, our recommendations prioritise community and user outcomes, while also considering costs and risks in implementation. As many of you would be aware, this is the first time the Australian Infrastructure Plan has included social infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, parks, community centres and social housing. This acknowledges the critical role these physical spaces and assets play in supporting the nation's wellbeing and economic prosperity, and in making Australia a great place to live. It also reflects how a growing and ageing population, technological advances, and major events such as natural disasters and the pandemic are changing how Australians live and work. More than ever, Australians appreciate the value of social infrastructure in supporting our communities. And as we continue to rebuild from the pandemic, we have a real opportunity to deliver social infrastructure that supports more equitable access to services and improves quality of life. An opportunity to deliver future-focused social infrastructure that opens up new possibilities for making Australia a healthier, more socially cohesive and economically productive nation. The pandemic has highlighted the need to strengthen our social infrastructure sector. Learn from the past to transform, digitally equipped and flexible. With this in mind, highlight the need for a robust, nationally consistent framework.
Hi, look, sorry about that. We seem to be having some technical difficulties with Romilly's connection, so please bear with us as we try and sort those out. She should be back very soon. And thanks. I think she's coming back now. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, apparently Minister Giles is still with us, so we're going to bring him back on and take the opportunity to ask some questions. Well, Mr. Giles, we get the chance after all. I have a few questions that came in that all looked really good. So I'm glad we get the chance to ask some of them to you now. But firstly, what federal policy levers do you think that we can use to better plan for climate resilience in our major cities?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think, firstly, the real fundamental building block, I think, is having a national urban policy framework that embeds sustainability, I think, is the first one. I think when we look at how transit operates, that's obviously the next really big question that comes here. And my colleague, Chris Bowen's obviously done a lot of work in this area, and I think you'll hear a bit more about our approach in that regard too. I think there's also been a significant missed opportunity in terms of the city deals that are presently on foot. Because I think if we're looking at the essence of these arrangements, it's putting in place long-term city shaping initiatives. And those 10, or I think in the discussions around Southeast Queensland, 20-year timescales give all participants, all levels of government and investors, the opportunity to make the sort of decisions we need to be making to reconfigure more sustainable cities. So that's sort of the 90-second version. There's obviously a much longer one to come.
No, appreciate that. And I have heard that I think Romilly's back online.
Oh,
so thank you for stepping in, and we'll now return to Romelu Mcgee.
You can hear and see me okay, Tom? Great, thank you. Yes, we do in the Australian Infrastructure Plan talk about the importance of broadband connections. Just start from where I think I was. The pandemic has highlighted the need to strengthen our social infrastructure sector and apply lessons learned from the past 2 years to transform the sector and deliver infrastructure that is fit for purpose, digitally equipped and flexible. With this in mind today, I will highlight the need for a robust, nationally consistent framework to capture and measure the real economic value of social infrastructure. This is critical to support effective and balanced investment. But first, I want to take a step back and highlight the social infrastructure challenges that our recommendations in the 2021 plan seek to respond to, as well as some of the additional pressures that have been brought about by the COVID pandemic. The 2021 plan is the reform response to the 180 challenges and opportunities identified in our 2019 Australian infrastructure audit. Some of you may remember reading about the audit when it was published 2 years ago. The audit found that overall, Australia has high-performing social infrastructure by international standards. However, high-quality service delivery is a significant challenge in a country where social infrastructure is located in disparate geographies and where our communities have very diverse needs. A real challenge for us is that access and service quality vary from different infrastructure types, places, and groups of Australians. Our community research found that Australians rate their experience with social infrastructure differently across sectors. And although the quality of social services is high, the assets that deliver them are often old and no longer suitable. For instance, over a quarter of Australians think that the quality and accessibility of social housing have declined over the past 5 years. The audit identified a general lack of appropriate social housing of the right type and in the right location. Noting that poor housing conditions such as overdue maintenance or overcrowding can create cross-sectorial impacts on other types of infrastructure such as health, education and justice. Ageing school assets was also identified as a key issue in the audit, with quite a large maintenance backlog for school assets and a lack of modern 21st century learning environments with flexibility to embrace new technologies and teaching methods. Now, remember, I'm talking about the audit from 2019, and that didn't obviously take on the changes that we've seen in the last 2 years because of COVID. We also looked at how green and blue recreation infrastructure is functioning. We found there are pressures in urban areas in both inner cities and on the urban fringe in connecting green assets in particular. The 2019 audit also found that Australians often access multiple and overlapping services, pointing to a need for better integration between social infrastructure providers. Adding another layer of complexity is, of course, the pandemic, which put additional pressure on our social infrastructure sectors. As we acknowledge in the 2021 plan, COVID pandemic exposed vulnerabilities across the sector and highlighted the need to strengthen it. We saw additional pressure on critical health facilities, with vast amounts of specialised medical equipment and supporting infrastructure needed. ICU capacity was made 7 times larger, and the number of ventilators more than doubled. Meeting these needs highlighted the value of having adaptable facilities that can quickly respond to vital community needs. The pandemic also put pressure on social and affordable rental housing. The economic downturn strained a system that was already severely restricted and highlighted the shortage of fit-for-purpose dwellings, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales. Over the next 15 years, it is projected Australia will need 730,000 new social housing properties, with demand significantly outpacing investment. COVID also had a devastating impact on the arts and culture sector. Once thriving, the sector contributed more than $115.2 billion to the economy in 2017-18 and employed 6% of the national workforce. However, 2 years of restrictions on venue capacity, interruptions and lockdowns, as well as domestic and international border closures, have had a serious impact. A more positive trend that came out of the pandemic was the move to more online services that we saw across multiple social infrastructure sectors. In line with the broader trend, our social infrastructure sectors leveraged digital technology. Education quickly turned to online learning for schools, vocational education and universities. There was an accelerated uptake of telehealth so patients could access healthcare. Art and cultural offerings shifted to online digital experiences. However, these changes highlighted the limitations of Australia's digital networks and equitable digital access. Many of you would have heard the expression digital divide. Finally, the pandemic also occasioned what we have termed the return of the neighbourhood, as more people embraced remote working and demand for community spaces grew. Green and blue spaces such as parks and waterways became vitally important for community recreation and maintaining mental health and wellbeing. Governments moved quickly to support this by relocating public spaces, for instance, opening up golf courses to other uses and creating pop-up cycle lanes. However, this highlighted the need for investment and reform to improve access to this kind of local infrastructure for all sections of the community. The 2021 plan details a number of recommendations to harness the potential of our social infrastructure in a post-pandemic world. In particular, we want to see support for new models for delivering services and continued investment in digital. The pandemic provided a unique opportunity to explore, trial, and further develop low-cost service delivery through digital technologies. As well as making access to healthcare, education, arts and culture more equitable, these new service delivery models have significant economic value that should be harnessed. Telehealth alone has the potential to save the healthcare system billions of dollars a year simply by reducing hospital admissions by 1 annual visit per person. However, to make the most of this opportunity, it is vital that governments continue to invest in smarter digital infrastructure. Facilitating shared use of assets is another key recommendation in the plan. Social infrastructure assets should be multifunctional, so they can be used by different groups for different purposes. Some schools have already established ongoing access arrangements with councils that allow sporting and community groups to use school facilities at agreed times. In return, councils provide funding for capital works or maintenance of the school. This will maximise the value of assets to the community and even generate revenue that can be used to maintain and upgrade these facilities. Of course, another key benefit of this approach is that it provides an alternative to the more resource-intensive option of developing new infrastructure. We also want to see greater emphasis on cross-sector collaborations. to help the social infrastructure sector recover from the profound effects of the pandemic and catalyse on growth. It is also vital to strengthen the connection between arts, culture, sport and tourism. There is an opportunity for all levels of government to actively work together to better align the planning and delivery of arts, cultural and recreational infrastructure. For this approach to be successful, there needs to be coordinated place-based strategic planning that aligns with regional identity statements, which define local attractions, needs and opportunities, and is undertaken in conjunction with land use planning and tourism strategies. The inclusion of arts, cultural and recreational infrastructure in planning for precinct developments and renewal projects clustered around strong transport nodes. Principles that promote multi-purpose use of new and existing facilities to drive economic development through tourism and job creation and diversify the use of community and commercial assets. This will help to ensure the facilities and spaces that are maintained and created are those that best serve the unique needs of each community. Valuing these cross-sector impacts is also critical, which brings me to my final point, which is the need to recognise social infrastructure as economic infrastructure too. Nationally, social service sectors contributed 15% of Australia's GDP in 2020. The sector employed over 3.5 million people, around 1/4 of Australia's workforce. Social infrastructure and the services it supports not only enables Australians to live better lives, it delivers substantial direct and indirect benefits to the nation's economy. We need a nationally consistent approach to identifying and evaluating the quadruple bottom line value of all social infrastructure investments. This will enable us to better demonstrate the economic role it plays and the social benefits that are attached to investing in more housing, education, arts and cultural institutions. In the case of social housing, there is a particular significant opportunity here for reform. We know that delivering safe, stable and appropriate social housing has a flow-on effect, reducing costs to the health, education and justice system. We also know that improving how the wider social and economic benefits of social housing are measured and assessed will help demonstrate the current high levels of demand and in turn support further investment. For this reason, the 2021 plan calls for a robust, nationally consistent and agreed methodology for assessing and quantifying these benefits that fully capture their quadruple bottom line value. This will enable decision makers to better assess social affordable housing projects, justify future investment and deliver a better balanced housing system, which would benefit all Australians. Through the 2021 plan, Infrastructure Australia has set an ambitious vision for reform. In the case of social infrastructure, our vision is for high quality, well-functioning and adaptable social infrastructure that meets a community's changing service needs responsively and efficiently. Investment in social infrastructure is essential for the health, well-being and economic prosperity of Australian communities. Improvement to the planning, design, delivery and use of social infrastructure assets can contribute to a better quality of life for every Australian. By embracing these reforms, Australians can enjoy appropriately designed, future-focused and accessible facilities that improve people's lives. Thank you again to Ahuri for inviting me to speak today at the webinar and for your support in this journey to date. I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Romilly. We appreciate what you've had to say to us this morning. And we also, again, just want to thank you personally for Infrastructure Australia's sponsorship of our conference today. We really appreciate that. We have time just for one or two, perhaps, very quick questions. So we'll just put a couple of things to you. Firstly, we're really thrilled to see social infrastructure included in the infrastructure plan as well. There's a question here that asks if you can just elaborate on the focus on place within the new infrastructure plan. Do you think this will lead to more local green and blue infrastructure investment priorities for Australia?
I'm just going to break that question down a bit. So one of the things that we had in the plan is 3 cross-cutting themes. One was industry, innovation and productivity. The second one was sustainability and resilience. And the third one was place-based communities. So the way we view place, and place is talked about and captured the whole way through the plan, and place was brought in when we released the orders as well in 2019. So the way we look at place is we want to see land use planning and transport and place and the unique opportunities around communities, and taking on board communities' feedback as the place-based approach. So it doesn't just focus on green and blue infrastructure, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. It looks at the whole place, the uniqueness of place, design and taking and decision-making opportunities, but more importantly, good stakeholder engagement of the community. Coming to blue and green infrastructure, critically important. We talk about the importance of that all the way through, both in the sustainability and resilience part of the plan, but also under our place-based and social infrastructure sections of the plan. Blue and green infrastructure is critically important in our cities. We need to protect it, we need to enhance it, and we need to ensure that in any of our major developments that we're taking on, and there's a proportion of blue and green infrastructure and blue infrastructure where it's available, but green infrastructure is critically important. We saw through COVID something like a 30% increase. Sorry, I'm in the hotel. I'll have to ignore it. A 30% increase people attending state and our national parks. And can you just put me on hold while I go and tell them I'm still here?
Interrupted yet again, but it sounds like Romilly will be back in just a moment. Look, at the end of this question, unfortunately, we will need to wrap up. So
don't you love the way that we're having to deal with all these things during the pandemic? It's either children interrupting us, breakdown in telecommunications, or someone ringing on the doorbell of the hotel.
Yeah, dogs barking in the background. Yeah. Thanks, Romilly. Sorry, you were in mid-sentence there.
Oh, yeah. So, look, I was just saying the great, really came out of the pandemic is the use of green infrastructure and the focus of green infrastructure. So we really do advocate the importance of blue infrastructure, so maintaining, protecting, but also enhancing the opportunities in the future for blue and green infrastructure. And that's captured in the plan.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And I indicated to our audience just a moment ago that we will need to wrap it up now after that question. But look, thank you. We do appreciate you joining us live from your hotel in Canberra. We hope you enjoy the rest of your time there. Again, thank you. And also thank you to all of this morning's speakers, to the Minister and to Mr. Giles. I invite our delegates now to take a short break, get yourself some morning tea, a cup of coffee, stretch your legs, and please return to the timeline at 10:45 in order to be ready for the next session. Now, following our break, my colleague at Uhuru, Dr. Gina Zapier, who is our Research Program Manager, will be joining you to facilitate the next session. And the theme of our next session is population mobility after COVID-19. So we look forward to a very interesting discussion then with a very interesting panel of guests. So until then, enjoy your break.